What is ham radio? You've been surfing the internet and you've come across this amateur ham radio thing, as they call it. But you don't know a whole lot about it, and you kind of want to learn more. Well, some of you might know more than others, but nevertheless, you want to learn more and see if this thing might be up your alley. Well, that's where I come in. Hey guys, I'm Eric, VA3FYB, the ham radio hoser, and today we're going to go over what exactly is ham radio. Let's jump right into it. Welcome to my presentation, everybody, an introduction to ham radio part 1. This is obviously going to be the first PowerPoint of 2 in a video series, kind of going over the fundamentals and basics of what exactly ham radio is. In this one, we're going to go over the bare bones, all the way from A to Z to kind of help you get started and get you informed. So, what exactly is ham radio, and why should you even really care about ham radio to begin with? Firstly, scope and intent is to make you aware. The purpose of this presentation is to, if you weren't already aware at all, or at least very little, what amateur ham radio exactly is, that's what we're going to try to make you do. And I also want to further inform, so if you were aware a bit already, I want to further inform you in order to pique your interest and aid you in finding out exactly what about this hobby interests you specifically, because what's going to interest you is going to be different than the next person and the next person after that. It's a multifaceted hobby, so everybody's going to find their own space and area that they enjoy more than others. And of course, by the end of this presentation, hopefully you should have a basic understanding of what ham radio is, how it works, how we utilize it, and what's most interesting to you. And why I want to make sure you find out what's most interesting to you is obviously it's what will keep you in the hobby and get you the most enjoyment and fulfillment out of it, but also it'll allow you to pursue and learn independently on your own through your own ambition. Because if you can't find what interests you in the hobby, even though it might be out there, if you can't find it initially, you're not going to want to learn and dive in deeper. So the table of contents, what exactly are we going to go over topic-wise in this presentation? We're going to go over a brief description of what ham radio is, try to narrow it down into a paragraph or two, which is quite the feat, by the way. What exactly are radios and how do they work? Seems like a simple question, but if we can kind of black box and abstract what radios are and how they work, it gives us a good foundation, a starting foundation. What are radio waves and what are they made out of? What's the tangible thing that they are? Number 4 is going to be what radio waves or frequencies do we as hams specifically get to use? There's lots of different bands and frequencies. We're going to go over specifically what hams get to use. Number 5, what radios do ham use? How do they look? What kind of form factors do they come in? That sort of thing. Number 6 is going to be propagation. So how do we get our signals from our radios out into the field and then to another person? And we're also going to go over a bit over the ionosphere in that one. Number 7 is going to be a quick one, but you may have heard the phrase, or if you haven't yet, you definitely will. When all else fails, ham radio works. It just works. We're going to go over a bit why that is the case. Number 8, once we cover everything, the end question is going to be, so what? Why should you even care? And we're going to touch on that topic. Bit of a heads up, it's going to be a balance between passion and service. And 9 at the end, we'll end it off with some statistics. So, firstly, a brief description of ham radio. This is kind of just a description that I've come up with. I tried to abstract the hobby and the service into 2 paragraphs, the best that I could, which is kind of hard because it's so grandiose and multifaceted, but I'll do my best just to give you a quick elevator speech as to what exactly it is. So, Firstly, amateur or ham radio is both a hobby and a service, so it's two things at the same time. With reference to the hobby side of it, as a hobby, ham radio allows 2 or more federally licensed radio operators from anywhere in the world to use bought or built equipment and utilize a plethora of radio frequencies to talk and exchange information instantaneously rather. So basically at the speed of light, not the speed of light in a vacuum, of course, but the speed of light in Earth's atmosphere. For various reasons and purposes, particular to their specific wants and needs. Because every singular person and every group of people are going to have very particular wants and needs and desires according to what they are trying to accomplish. Now, as a service, ham radio operators are called upon in natural disasters and emergencies to provide backup radio communication support using their knowledge, their expertise, and their own equipment to assist professionals in providing support and relief to the public. So there's lots of various instances where ham radio operators have been called upon to help certain emergency services get information in and out of disaster areas and between groups of people to better serve the public when traditional forms of communication are just simply not available or aren't working. So, what does this look like? As a hobby and as a service, what does ham radio look like? What are a couple of things that we can do with inside the hobby? Well, as a hobby, ham radio is a hobby of hobbies. It's so multifaceted that you can't really put it into one singular box. There's a plethora of things within it that we can do. And sometimes they're fairly distant apart in what they kind of cover in scope. So that's why lots of different people who might be interested into slightly related but two different things would get into amateur radio because it's so multifaceted. There's an aspect of the hobby for everyone, like I'm saying. One thing is rag chews. Rag chews are basically just a couple of good old boys getting on the air and talking about what they did that week / that weekend. Shooting the you-know-what on the air with their buddies. Nets, another thing, kind of similar, but more structured and formal, maybe at a particular time, at a particular frequency on a particular day, once a week type of thing. Contesting, there's a myriad of contests, basically racking up points for you or your group and just kind of competing game-wise against other radio operators. Summer Winter Field Day, kind of like a contest, not really, I guess, but basically 2 times a year, once in the summer, once in the winter, getting out and making a whole day of just doing radio in the field, completely portable and off-grid. The OTAs, there's a couple of different on-the-air, OTA, type of aspects to the hobby. SOTA, POTA, IOTA, JOTA, etc. So that would be summits on the air, go hike up a mountain, activate on top of a mountain. POTA, go to like a national or federal / provincial or state park. IOTA, islands on the air, boat out to an island, that type of thing. You're activating an entity, whether it be a mountain, a park, an island, etc. D-expeditions are a really big thing. That's basically where a couple of brave souls go to really remote locations all over the world and set up for maybe a couple of days their station, and basically everybody all over the world tries to make contacts with those people in that very remote and hard to get to location that most people have never activated before. Propagation and space weather, people like looking into and researching and keeping track of that. Lots of different soldering aspects in the hobby. Kit building, so you might get like a very relatively simple like radio kit, maybe like a simple Morse code radio kit that only does Morse code, and you solder it and you put it together. It comes as a bag of parts. Circuitry and circuit board design, a lot of makers in the makerspace also do ham radio stuff, designing their own radios, amplifiers, antennas, stuff like that with circuitry. Antenna and theory design, people like to build and make their own antennas and just learn about and study them. RF theory and radio design, pretty similar. Off-grid communications, there's a lot of people in the, for lack of a better word, prepper space, or even like homesteading spaces, just kind of like off-grid. We still want some form of communications. People get into ham radio for that purpose as well. Personal preparedness goes along with that. Assisting emergency services during disasters, we touched on that a little bit. People do have to have a sense of serving their community and helping out other people. They also can do that within this hobby. Some examples include things like Ares, RACES, Mars, CAP, ACS, CERT, Oxcom, and the Red Cross, and the Salvation Army. We won't go over, that's a lot of acronyms, we won't go over them. You can search those up yourself. But those are some ham radio groups that assist certain different government or nonprofit institutions. We will come back to this slide later in the whole presentation. So at this point, if I was doing this presentation live, I would kind of do this interactively with the audience, but if you want to pause this at any point and kind of think to yourself and chip in before I bring up the answers, feel free to. I think it's important. We do kind of take for granted radio communications on a daily basis. We don't really have a good relationship and understanding what we're using daily in the modern era. So that's why I kind of have this slide in here to make that connection between people and radios and kind of understand you're using radios all day, every day already. So this isn't really that far of a stretch getting into this hobby. So radios are all around you. Some examples. Before if I was doing this in person, I'd get people to list some examples of what are some radios that you can think of. These are some of the examples that I've come up with. So AM, FM in your car, of course. Your Walmart walkie-talkies, the Spider-Man and Hello Kitties, you get those little blister pack radios. Business and commercial handhelds and mobiles, so different businesses and corporations, or even first responders and emergency services. Those are some radios that we kind of know and understand and see. Satellites are still technically radios, so sat phones, sat communicators, etc. Anything to do with GNSS, which would include GPS, GLONASS, the Iridium constellation, GEO and LEO. Any of those satellite services that we use daily through many different means are all technically radios. Your TV remote, how they work, invisible infrared light, it's kind of technically a radio. You are using light waves. Your garage door opener also usually uses infrared. ID passes and badges, your little tap, or even like credit cards would be a good example. Those use RFID and NFC, so near field communications and radio frequency identification. Car key fobs, similar process. Remote lights and cameras. Satellite and cellular internet, so think Starlink for like satellite internet, or if you're in Canada, Rogers is cell provider, or if you're in the States, AT&T would be a popular cell provider. Wi-Fi routers, those we use Wi-Fi daily. Those are technically radios. Bluetooth, also we use a lot of that. As I go down this list, ask yourself, are we noticing a pattern here? Do you notice any of these kind of showing up in your life? Maybe there's one specific thing in your life that kind of encompasses a lot of this that you might think of, we use on a daily basis. That's right, your phone. Your phone is a supercomputer with many different types of radios in it all at once, and you're using your phone daily, sometimes hours a day. So cellular, again, is technically radio. Wi-Fi is technically radio. So is Bluetooth. Your phone's also got GPS and maybe some other satellite services, depending on what type of phone or how new your phone is. RFID, NFC, all these processes within your phone are kind of technically radios. You're using so much radio on a daily basis and you don't even know it. You might even be taking it for granted. And that's kind of why what I wanted to express in this slide here. Getting into the radio hobby, it's not that far-fetched if you don't know a whole lot. You're using radios constantly every single day, and you might not even know it. So don't be overwhelmed. The hobby is actually relatively easy to get into and understand once you get a good solid foundation. What is a radio? Describe how it works. We've talked kind of about the different types of radios we see and use on a daily basis, but how do they work in a very broad and general, abstract black box kind of way? So, some radio basics. The radios we know and use, if we talk and listen with them, are more precisely called transceivers. And the word transceiver is just a conjunction of the words transmitter and receiver. Transmitter and receiver are two distinct parts. When you put them together and use them together, we call that a transceiver. So, not all radios are transceivers though. If you just listen with your radio, for example, your car AM/FM radio, it's just a receiver. Now, if it just talks, maybe a good example would be a broadcast radio station, like broadcast AM, broadcast FM. They're not really listening. They're basically just transmitting. That would be a transmitter. But if your radio talks and listens, if it does both, that's a transceiver. Remember, just a conjunction of two different words. So, radios typically transmit on a single frequency at a given time. What radios do is they actually alter, or what we call modulate, the outgoing signal at the given frequency, and we modulate or alter the outgoing signal to impart information on that signal, such as the human voice, music, digital data, telemetry, which is like, speed, position, stuff like that, and lots more. Some common modulation schemes, some examples of those would be AM, FM, PM, and FSK. AM and FM, everybody's pretty much heard those and is familiar with them. Amplitude modulation, frequency modulation. So obviously those are a good starting point to understand. And then things like phase modulation and frequency shift keying are some other common modes of modulation. Now, I like to add in this animation, hopefully it's playing okay. As you can see up on the top with the dark black line, we've kind of got the unadulterated signal coming out of the radio. If it wasn't modulated, didn't have any information. Well, we call that a carrier signal. That's vibrating at the frequency that we've chosen to transmit on. And then things like AM and FM, we're kind of squishing or contracting or stretching the wave in different ways. With AM, we're doing that via the amplitude, and with FM, we're doing that via the frequency. And by altering and changing the wave like that, we're imparting information on that carrier. And at the receiving end, we can then demodulate that and figure out what that information on that carrier is actually saying. So, we've talked about radios and kind of how they work in a general abstract sense, but what about the actual radio waves themselves? The stuff in between two different radios, coming out of one radio and going into the other. What are they? What are they made out of? Well, we have to talk about the electromagnetic spectrum as a whole first. The electromagnetic spectrum is the entire spectrum possible, or possible states of electromagnetic waves, and we can measure this in either frequency, so for example hertz, or wavelength, for example meters. And then with hertz and meters, we can then use metric prefixes, for example, to scale that. So we can do hertz, kilohertz, so thousands of hertz, megahertz, millions of hertz, gigahertz, billions of hertz, for example. And then wavelengths, obviously got meters, kilometers. We can go up and down either way to expand, but the base units will be hertz and meters. This is a very beautiful graphic. I love this. This is kind of showing the entire electromagnetic spectrum here. A good starting point is the visible spectrum. So that is light waves that we use to actually see that activate inside our eyes. And you can see it's about roughly maybe 450 to 750 nanometers is what we're, with visible light we kind of measure in nanometers. But as you can see, on this entire spectrum, we got this little sliver of visible light that we use to see colors here. We've got everything all the way up from cosmic rays all the way down to very, very long radio waves and even electricity. But things like radio waves, AM, FM, microwaves, infrared, UV, X-rays, gamma rays, cosmic rays, and visible light, it's all on the same spectrum, all made of the same stuff, for lack of a better word. The only thing different is the frequency / wavelength, and then of course the energy as well, how much energy it has. But it's basically the same stuff when it comes down to it, which is a fascinating thought, that the same stuff that you use to see that's hitting your eye is the same stuff that we use to talk on walkie-talkies. Again, here we got like a carrier, just a simple sine wave, how it goes up and down over time. Furthermore, talking about looking at the relationship between light and radio waves, in the quantum science world, electromagnetic radiation may be expressed or described as either a wave or a particle, depending on how you observe it and measure it. So light can be expressed both as a wave or a photon. That's called wave-particle duality. And I'm just trying to get you to understand that the same stuff that we use to see, the stuff that comes out of the sun, stuff that comes out of a flashlight, is the same stuff as a chest x-ray you might get, UV that comes out of the sun, the microwave that you use to heat up your food in the microwave, radio waves, even all the way down to AC. It's the same stuff. It's just the wavelength / frequency, and of course how much energy it has is the only difference factor. Now, depending on how we design a radio can generate waves or radiate at the desired frequency or wavelength for an intended purpose. This is a super important part about ham radio. Your purpose dictates the frequency that you want to use. This is a super important concept. What you're trying to achieve is going to dictate what frequencies you want to use. We can then, once we are radiating at a given frequency, we can then alter or modulate the signal coming out of the radio at the given frequency to convey our information, like previously stated. Again, I will reiterate, your purpose dictates the frequency you want to use. Frequencies and bands are like tools. One is not better than the other. You have to just use the right tool for the right job to get that specific job done. One is not better than the other. They're different. They're parallel. So use the right frequency and bands to get your specific job done. Again, we have another graphic here. There's a bit, it doesn't really matter too much about what's going on, except I wanted to show you that red squiggly line that's doing this. You can see as we go up, the frequency changes. We get increasing frequency, yet shorter wavelengths. Again, here's another one. I really like this one just because it kind of includes some more information. Basically, what I'm trying to get is that the radio spectrum here is a slice within the entire electromagnetic spectrum. So up at the top, we got cosmic rays, down to gamma rays, X-rays, ultraviolet, visible light, the light we use to see, infrared, then the radio spectrum, and then we've got some really low frequency stuff. Again, trying to get you to understand it's all the same stuff, whatever stuff is. It's just the frequency / wavelength that is the differing factor. Here's a bunch of stuff. You don't have to memorize all these numbers, but it's just to kind of get you to understand some more. The International Telecommunications Union, doesn't matter who they are, but they internationally defined radio spectrum band definitions. So we've got all of these something LF, so TLF, ELF, SLF, ULF, VLF, doesn't matter what they stand for, but as you can see, an interesting fact is they're all on multiples of 3 at orders of magnitude of 10. So you've got number 3 goes up by an order of magnitude, multiplied by 10. So 1 to 3, 3 to 30, 30 to 300 hertz, 300 hertz to 3000 hertz. Then we're getting into kilohertz because we're at 1000, 3 to 30 kilohertz, 30 to 300 kilohertz, and you get the pattern. This little curly brace here, the MF to the SHF, that's kind of where us hams hang out. So MF would be medium frequency, HF would be high frequency, VHF would be very high frequency, UHF would be ultra high frequency, and SHF would be super high frequency. That space kind of from the 300 kilohertz up to the 30 gigahertz is about where we hang out. Now that's a lot of space, but we do have a lot of bands kind of chopped up and spread all over that very large area. I threw this in at the end for any of the nerds out there that were kind of noticing a pattern or were wondering. As frequency increases, wavelength decreases, so they are inversely proportional. And if you remember, if you learned it all back in high school physics, this little equation in physics class, V equals F lambda, or more accurately, C equals F lambda. We can use V because C is the absolute speed of light. Speed of light changes depending on what medium it's traveling through, but they're basically the same thing. So as frequency goes up, if our V or our C is going to stay constant, if the F goes up, the lambda has to go down. If the lambda goes up, the F has to go down. They're inversely proportional. Just a little math stuff there. Okay, now, what radio waves or frequencies do hams specifically get to use? We're going to go over just what the hams use because there's lots of frequencies all over the place. We can't cover them all. We're just going to talk about amateur radio in this case. And the different groups of frequencies, we call them bands. So, little blurb here. Each country's government has the job of divvying up the radio spectrum amongst its countless users. One of those many users are ham radio operators. That's us. Hams have many bands spread across the entire radio spectrum. Bands are like sandboxes. So this is kind of an analogy, just a way to conceptualize what a band is. They are discrete areas that we get to play in, but we must play inside the boundaries. Kind of a larger analogy I like to use. Say you've got a big soccer field or something like that. That entire soccer field is the entire radio spectrum. Now, across that entire soccer field, you could have little sandboxes kind of blotched all over the place. Those little sandboxes, you got some 4x4s in a little square, and you got the sand in it. Those are the bands that are spread out across the entire radio spectrum. And they've got the little borders, the little 4x4s. You got to play inside those. You got a bunch spread out all over the radio spectrum to do different things, and you can utilize them in different ways. You just got to play inside those little sandboxes. Now, this is a chart that I got off the Government of Canada website, and this is, you can actually download this as a PDF and zoom all the way in. This is how the entire radio spectrum in Canada is divvied up amongst all of its possible users. This is a very cool chart to look at. But specifically for amateur radio, this is the band planned as designated by the Radio Amateurs of Canada, RAC. And as you can see, this is everybody across the entire radio spectrum. Across that entire radio spectrum, we have all of these bands, plus more. These are just the HF ones. But we have all of these bands spread out across that entire radio spectrum. This I got off of the United States government website. As you can see, they look relatively similar to the Canadian one, but again, what I'm trying to get across is each government has the job of organizing and divvying up all of these slices of the radio spectrum. The radio spectrum is very finite. We've only got so much. The government has to do its best so that all users can have their own little sandbox to do their own little things in. And this is from the Amateur Radio Relay League, the ARRL, which is the American equivalent of the RAC, and this is their band plan for their amateur radio bands that they have laid out. As you can see, this is a lot of work, so people have big jobs trying to divvy up all of this stuff, both at the government and at the lobbying body level, so we try not to take it for granted. Enough about bands, let's talk about radios, let's talk about the gear. This is what everybody likes to talk about. What do they look like? What's their form factor? What am I getting into? These are not definitive, there's only 5 main form factors, but just me personally looking at the radios available currently into the amateur radio world, I've noticed 5 main form factors, so via me, for the purposes of this presentation, we'll kind of break it down into 5 main form factors that you will see amateur radios come in. Firstly is the base station. So you can kind of think of this like the desktop computer. It's a bigger box, usually more power, usually more functions and capabilities. It sits on your desk. Second one, most popular, you'll see mobile. So it's mainly meant for in the car. There are exceptions. People, especially with the radios that are available today, people still put mobiles both in their car and in their house. We'll get into that later as to why. Portable, kind of a similar physical form factor usually to mobile, but different purposes, different scenarios, different application, and kind of using that for going portable in the field. Often similar size and structure to a mobile, but there are lots of smaller and more compact ones as well that you wouldn't find or put in a vehicle. Of course, the infamous, probably the most popular or recognizable, a handheld. A simple handheld that you keep on your person. And the fifth, and an intriguing one, is what we like to call a shack-in-the-box. It kind of does a lot of things. It's a jack of all trades. It doesn't do one thing particularly well or the best. It just does a decent, mediocre job at everything, all in one complete box. And of course, there's always going to be exceptions to the rule. There's going to be some quirky and unique radios that don't really fit into a hardline category. They're kind of a thing of their own. They know no bounds. Now, these are kind of the 5 main form factors, physical form factors that you'll see in amateur radios. And they're usually, for the purposes of this video, I'll try to make it simple, we'll split them up into 2 main use cases, 2 main types of propagation. So, propagation, basically, as a word, propagation just means ways of getting our signal out of the radio, into the airwaves, to another person. That's what we mean when we say propagation. Now, the 2 main types, for simplicity purposes, is line of sight and beyond line of sight propagation. So what line of sight means is basically what the word says, can I see what I am trying to communicate with? So if it's beyond the horizon, meaning you can't see it, for all intents and purposes, that's not line of sight. Or if you're using line of sight communication, propagation, you're probably not going to make it. Now, beyond line of sight is when we're trying to communicate with someone or something that we cannot see. So beyond the horizon, very far away, hundreds to maybe thousands of kilometers and miles away. Now, for those who know better, this is just a caveat. This isn't set in stone. I'm just kind of trying to simplify it for new users and people who are interested. So take this with a grain of salt. This is not a hard, fast rule. It's just a good way to conceptualize and think about line of sight versus beyond line of sight. So for line of sight, we're talking basically about anything above 30 megahertz. So VHF, UHF, and SHF, very high frequency, ultra high frequency, and super high frequency. Those are the things that we are usually referencing when we're talking about line of sight communications. And if we remember back to the ITU band designations, We've got 30 here, so number 3 on an order of magnitude or a multiple of 10. VHF is 30 to 300 megahertz. UHF is 300 to 3000 megahertz or 3 gigahertz, and then SHF would be 3 gigahertz to 30 gigahertz. So anything above 30 megahertz or VHF, we're talking about line of sight communication. Now for beyond line of sight communication or propagation, we're going to usually be referencing anything below 30 megahertz. So that's HF, which is 3 to 30 megahertz, MF, which is 300 to 3000 kilohertz, and then VLF, which would be 30 to 300 kilohertz. Nope, I messed that up. You know what I mean, though. I'm talking about the ITU bands. Anything below 30 megahertz, so below VHF, that's high frequency, medium frequency, and that should be low frequency, not very low frequency. We're talking about beyond line of sight. So to kind of put this into perspective, where does our 5 main form factors kind of show up on this chart? So our handhelds and our mobiles that we put in our cars and keep on our person, these are typically, for the most part, going to be VHF and above. They're utilizing VHF and above frequencies, and we're using them to talk to people that we have a pretty good line of sight communication with, excluding repeaters. We'll get into that. So below 30 megahertz are beyond line of sight. Desktop are our base station rigs, our big HF rigs that are sitting on our desk in our house. That's usually what those kinds of frequencies the base stations are utilizing. And then some unique ones, the shack in the box and the portable form factors, those usually are going to utilize both. They're going to have some setbacks because they're trying to do everything all at once. They're going to do it kind of well, but they're not going to do any one thing particularly very well like a base station or a mobile or a handheld would. So they're going to usually probably have sometimes all the way down into the medium frequencies, so that would be like 160 meters, all the way up into the 70 centimeter band or the UHF frequencies. For example, that shack in the box, that's the Yaesu FT991A, that does all the way from 160 to 70 meters, I think, 70 centimeters. Don't think it does 1.2 gig. And portable, kind of like a shack in the box, that's the Yaesu not the 891, the 818ND. It does all the way from HF to UHF, but it's in a portable, small form factor, so it's very small and compact. You can pack it with you, and its kind of downfall, it doesn't have like a nice screen or some other things that the 991A might have, and it's severely lower in power, what we call QRP, which means usually less than 10 watts of power. Little note for myself to remind you guys, some power ratings and expected distances and the places you'll find them. Well, I mentioned the places you'll find them, but our handhelds using line of sight communications are typically almost always 5 watts of power. Our mobiles are usually highest power is about 50 watts. That's what we'd put in a car, or even if we have a mobile in our house. They're going to be about 50 watts. Your base station rig is going to be 100 watts, but remember, your base station rig's probably going to be operating on HF, while your handheld and mobile is going to be operating on, for example, VHF and UHF. Your shack in the box might do a couple of different power levels. That 991A, for example, will do 100 watts on the HF bands, but it'll only do about, I think, 75 or 50 on VHF, and then maybe about 50 or 40 on UHF. So it'll have different power levels depending on what bands you are using. And then I went over pretty quickly, portables are usually QRP, so about 5 or less, 10 or less watts, sometimes 5 or less watts. Now, propagation. How do we get this signal out, and how do we get heard? We've talked about the radios, how they work, the types of propagation, where we see and use these radios, but how do we get out and how do we get heard? How do the radio waves actually work when we're communicating with other people? Well, we'll dive deeper into line of sight communications. So for line of sight communications, These certain frequencies usually require an unobstructed view, hence line of sight, between the 2 or more radios that we're utilizing. These frequencies are typically VHF and up, as previously stated, so 30 megahertz and up. A little diagram here with 2 guys just talking on 2 handhelds. That's kind of what we're going over. Now, because these frequencies require an unobstructed view or an unobstructed path to the target, obstructions, things in the way, such as buildings, forests, hills, even the curvature of the Earth, or I didn't put it on here, but if you go up in frequency significantly, even things like rain and cloud and fogs, can heavily degrade, or even completely stop all possible communications. Again, because it's line of sight that we're talking about. Now, even though things might be degraded or completely halted, we can still utilize these frequencies with a couple of tricks. So to use these frequencies at all, or to greater distances, we have some methods to help us out. We can utilize repeaters, which are essentially additional radios that listen and then retransmit the message that we're transmitting into them simultaneously. So you key up your handheld or your mobile, it sends what you're saying to a repeater. At the same time that the repeater's listening, it retransmits what you're saying. Now, that isn't very useful on its own, but what we do with that repeater is what becomes very useful. Now, to make it more interesting, we can put that repeater up on a high tower, like a cell phone tower, for example. A lot of amateur radio repeaters are on cell phone towers. Or even put that repeater on a tower, but put that tower again on a hill or a mountain to even further increase our area of coverage. So if I'm talking to a repeater that's up high, I talk to it, I can only see the repeater, but the repeater can see down in a cone a lot farther than I can. Put that up on a tower, put that tower on a hill, you can increase that circumference of what that repeater can see, therefore increasing the radius at which I can talk to other people. And this is an example here, this little diagram. Line of sight wise, that guy cannot see his friend because he's on the other side of a mountain, but that repeater up on that tower on that hill, he can then talk to his friend even when the mountain is in the way. Now, we can even extend this to the max and put repeaters on satellites that orbit the Earth. There is actually right now, as we speak, a repeater on the International Space Station that you can use. I've used it, and it's quite interesting. You, obviously, going all the way up to the International Space Station, there's nothing in the way when I look up into the sky between me and the space station, as long as it's flying overhead. So me talking up to him, when it repeats down, it's got a huge radius, relatively speaking, of which I can talk to other amateur radio operators. And that might look something like that. And if we want to include the internet in our radio communications, take this globally, we can connect our repeaters and our radios to the internet and send our voices and messages all over the world through internet linking. And I don't know how well you can see this diagram, but this is a little diagram here. Somebody might be driving along in their car, key into a repeater, that repeater is connected to the internet. Over an internet link, the computer at our different repeater site on the other side of the world might be going into a physical repeater, which might go out into another person that is talking in their car. So you got 2 people in their cars just using their radios in their car, and theoretically they could be talking halfway across the world to each other through internet linking. A little factoid I'd like to throw in here. At VHF frequencies roughly, the radio horizon, meaning your physical horizon that you can see, is different than what the radio waves can see. It's actually 4/3 the visual horizon. So under ideal conditions, radio waves at the VHF frequencies actually go just a little bit further, about 33% further than what you can actually see. They curve a little bit with the Earth, and then they fly off and into outer space. Now, beyond line of sight communications. If we need to or want to talk further than line of sight can provide, we can use frequencies that go beyond line of sight, so beyond line of sight communications. As we talked about earlier, these frequencies are typically HF and below, meaning 30 megahertz and below. Again, this 30 megahertz above and below thing, when referencing beyond a line of sight, and line of sight is kind of just a generalization for to make it easier for those newer into the hobby to conceptualize. It's not a steadfast rule, and there are some bands in and around there that are going to kind of break that rule, but we won't cover those. Beyond line of sight propagation can also be referred to as skywave or skip. You might have heard those terms before. These frequencies will reflect and refract. Reflection and refraction are two different things, but radio waves do both when they meet the ionosphere, off the ionosphere, and come back to Earth much farther away. Sometimes these radio waves will bounce multiple times, creating a skip effect, sometimes traveling all the way around the world, coming up behind you, and you can hear yourself a couple seconds later. Under very, very pristine conditions, you can do that, and it's pretty cool. Here's a little diagram. As we can see, we got our transmitter here. It's shooting radio waves off at an angle, bouncing off the ionosphere, and coming back down at a much farther location. And we've got a similar thing here, a graph. As you can see, I think this is for... I'm not gonna get into it too much, but as you can see, at a super high angle, our radio waves actually punch through the ionosphere, and as we bring that angle down a little bit, then they start reflecting off. And as you change the angle, the radio waves, when they come back down, go either farther or closer to you, depending on how farther or closer away you are trying to reach your target. And another thing, just talking about another diagram illustrating how skip kind of bounces around the ionosphere for the planet. We can change how far or close we want to communicate by designing different types of antennas and the angle at which they shoot off into free space. A lesser angle will land farther away, whereas a greater angle will land closer. You can see that in the diagram that illustrates with the red lines. The angle, greater angle, it's going to come back down closer to you. A shallower angle or a smaller angle, and it'll have a better angle to get down and farther away. Sometimes if the angle is too great, it won't bounce off the ionosphere at all, but will instead punch right through and travel into space basically forever. Now, depending on the frequencies used and our antenna design, our signal might have a skip zone, where basically no one will hear us if they're close enough to our location. A little thing called NVIS can fix this. So if you look at, again, that illustration, you can see there's this little zone where no radio waves, when they come back down, are coming. And it's kind of, that illustration is between 0 and 1,000 kilometers. Take that with a grain of salt. But there's this skip zone where if somebody was in there that we were trying to communicate, that was a target, they wouldn't necessarily hear us. And NVS will fix this solution. So NVS, Near Vertical Incident Skywave, is a different beyond line of sight method. In some instances, we want to talk further than what line of sight, so VHF and above, can provide, but not as far as traditional beyond line of sight, or what we call DX, meaning long distance, provides, as we would likely have a significant skip zone with DX where no one could hear us. Again, from that example, there was a 0 to 1,000 kilometer distance skip zone illustrated there. In these instances, we use similar HF frequencies, but deploy our antenna in an NVIS or an NVIS configuration. Antennas deployed in an NVIS configuration shoot radio waves up at a large enough angle as possible without punching straight through the ionosphere, so they come back down to Earth in a smaller radius than normal DX, but larger than VHF and above, effectively trying to eliminate the skip zone. So you won't get as far as traditional DX, you get a lot farther than VHF line of sight, but we're trying to eliminate that skip zone. This is useful if we want regional communications. Think the size of a province or a state. If we live in a very deep valley or gully, on the scale of geography, where mountains would block the shallow angle of our DX. And here's two more illustrations kind of show. The one in the middle there showing somebody living in a very deep valley. They wouldn't be able to get their radio waves out with normal antennas. They'd have to configure NVIS because of how steep those mountains on either side of them are. And the one below kind of shows what you might expect angle-wise and distance-wise for NVIS and DX. Just trying to give some perspective. Now, we've talked about radio waves and propagation, but how are they doing this? Well, they're doing this via the ionosphere. We bounce our radio waves off it, but what exactly is it? What is the ionosphere? The ionosphere, like ogres and onions, have layers. The layers of the ionosphere. The ionosphere is a very complex and in-depth topic, one I don't think I'm very qualified to talk about. And even if I was, there's just too much to go over in a single PowerPoint. But in the gist, the ionosphere is the ionized or charged region of our atmosphere between 48 kilometers and 965 kilometers above sea level that has many functions. It's ionized and charged by the sun's solar radiation. So the sun basically charges up and ionizes those layers. The ionosphere has multiple layers that do different things, and the layers do change from day to night. These layers are what reflect and refract our radio waves and allow for long-distance communications, including NVIS. If we didn't have those layers in the ionosphere, there would be nothing for our radio waves to bounce back off and come back down to Earth. They just keep going forever off into outer space, and we wouldn't be able to communicate across the world like we do. Here's an example, a little illustration. During the night, we've mainly got the E and the F layer. During the day, we get a D layer below the E layer, and the solid 1F layer of the night gets split into the F1 and F2. You've got two different charged ionized regions. So about 2 layers in the night, and about 4 layers during the day. Again, here's another illustration. As you can see, the solid singular F region and the E region on the night side of the planet, and on the day side of the planet, you've got the F1, F2, the E, and the D region, or layers. Aside from influencing radio wave propagation, the ionosphere also protects us from the sun's intense solar radiation and charged particles. When strong radiation particles hit our atmosphere, what we see is the northern lights. That's those waves and particles interacting with our ionosphere. Without our ionosphere, we'd likely be dead due to all that radiation and particles just lambasting the planet. So be thankful, not just for radio communications, but for saving our butts. Here's a little video showing kind of what happens to our ionosphere and magnetosphere when the Earth gets hit with a strong flare. As you can see, the colors change. This might not mean a lot to you, I just thought it was kind of artistically appealing. But as you can see, what happens when the Earth gets pounded by the sun's solar radiation and charged particles. That's it for that. Now we talked, this will be kind of a brief one, but you may have heard the phrase, and if you haven't yet, as you get into the hobby, you will hear it more. When all else fails, ham radio works. Ham radio just works, and there's a couple of reasons for it. When all else fails, ham radio works, and that's because we have the capacity to be independent, decentralized, and completely self-sufficient. Essentially, we don't have to rely on anybody else. We can serve and assist emergency services when requested, and often do. One thing that usually happens every year is hurricanes down in the south of the states and in the north of the South Americas. Hurricane watch nets, for example. Amateur radio operators are utilized to get information in and out of areas where traditional means of communication have been lost or broken. And we can do this because we don't have the reliance on pre-established systems of communication. That's decentralization. For example, we don't have to rely on the internet, we don't have to rely on cellular services, we don't have to rely on satellites, and we don't have to rely on the myriad of other government and corporate systems and services. We're also completely self-powered when we need and want to be. So we mainly use a 12-volt nominal system, meaning so much of the majority of the stuff in the amateur radio world is built to run on a 12-volt nominal system. Batteries, devices, radios, you name it. It's designed with this in mind, that everything should just work together on a 12-volt nominal system. But additionally, we can also run off of generators, batteries, solar, wind, etc., basically indefinitely, as long as we have gas or diesel or what have you for generators, as long as we have batteries in good working order, as long as the sun shines, the wind blows, or whatever renewables you can think of, and those mixed together as well, used in conjunction, we can run indefinitely if need be. And amateur radio can be the source of local and global communications for both yourself, your family, your friends, and if you want, the broader community that surrounds you during a disaster and in times of need. Because of all of this, because we are self-reliant, independent, and decentralized, and we don't have to rely on basically anybody else but ourselves, we can be this support structure when times call for it. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is you only have to rely on you. Now, it is definitely ideal and advantageous to build a strong network and community around amateur ham radio and emergency communications, but with that being said, what makes amateur radio so robust and allows it to survive is because that isn't required. Even though it's ideal and advantageous, it's not required. A very limited and small number of individuals can maintain a robust communications network almost indefinitely if need be. So what? With all this information we've talked about, what does it all mean and why should you even care? Well, I told you we'd return to a slide earlier. We're going to go over passion and service. As I said, ham radio is both a hobby and a service. So on the hobby side, we have this passion that we want to struggle and strive for. And on the service side, some of us like to serve our friends, family, and community. So ham radio is a hobbies, as we've talked about. That entire list that we went over earlier, I've kind of split up in green and red. All these things from rag chews to RF theory and radio design is kind of focused around you and what you want to get out of the hobby, what you're interested in, and what excites you. The things in red might also interest and excite you, but also there's a sense of duty and service, if you so choose, you don't have to, where you can help others. Maybe it's just your immediate family, maybe you include some friends in that, or maybe you also include your local community, or even your state, or even your entire country. This sense of duty and service, we can also do this within the hobby. So there's this balance, and they are two separate things, but there's this interconnection between passion and service within the hobby. So if you care about either of those, or any of these interest you, this hobby might be something you want to look into. To give you some quick examples, ask these questions to yourself in your head. Do you like learning new facets of electronics, electricity, magnetic fields of science? Do you like talking with like-minded individuals all over the globe or locally via radio? Basically, are you just a radio nerd? Do you like to talk on radios? Do you like going to events with like-minded individuals and maybe make a game out of it, like a contest, kind of gamify it and gain points and compete? Do you like going up on hikes or in mountains, camping in parks, but you're also a bit of a tech nerd? Amateur radio is great for you. There's lots of things like parks on the air and summits on the air. And hiking and camping and backpacking definitely go along with amateur radio surprisingly well. Do you like going to extreme and remote locations? Are you a bit of an adrenaline junkie? And maybe bring a radio with you? Well, de-expeditions might be for you, going to some extremely remote and, quite frankly, dangerous places just to activate and play radio. I can only imagine the adrenaline high you might get from such a thing. Maybe de-expeditions are the thing for you. Do you like learning about space weather and how the sun affects the Earth, and how our ionosphere and our magnetosphere and how everything changes weather on Earth as well? So the sun affects our space weather and the space weather affects our Earth weather. Does that interest you? Well, you might be interested in that part of the hobby. Do you like basically anything to do with the maker space? Do you like soldering, building, making, fine electronics, circuitry and circuit boards, etc.? Well, maybe antenna design, radio design, amplifier design, stuff like that might interest you. Do you like to learn complex mathematical and physical phenomena like radio theory, antenna theory, and wave theory, etc.? More of the physics and the mathematics and the theoretical thinking side of the hobby. That might be something that you would be interested and like. Now, do you want reliable communications when off-grid or portable? Whether you're hiking, camping, boating, long sea voyages, a simple power outage, cellular and internet dead zones. There are surprisingly still people in North America and in the Western Hemisphere that have cellular and internet dead zones. It's not common, but it's still a thing. Do you want reliable communications when disaster strikes? Depending on where you live, you might experience serious natural disasters like storms, hurricanes, monsoons, tornadoes, earthquakes, wildfires, solar flares. We'll touch on that in a second, like the Carrington event. If you want reliable communications that you can rely on because you know they're yours and what you're capable of and don't have to rely on governments or corporations to provide communications for you, maybe amateur radio is something you want to get into. Things like solar flares and CMEs can cause widespread power, or any natural disasters, period. Widespread power and communication and grid failures. Again, when all else fails, ham radio just works. Do you want to help others, whether that be friends, family, or community, send and receive invaluable information and messages in and out of disaster scenarios? Or it doesn't even have to be a disaster. It can just be in times of need when local communications or any form of communications, traditionally speaking, are not available. So, from both the passion and the service side, do you like XYZ? Do you want XYZ? Any of these things listed here? If so, amateur radio may very well be the thing for you, and you might want to get more involved and interested and researching how to get into the hobby and what interests you and what you want to take away from it. Little thing I want to touch on very quickly. I haven't seen them very recently, but a couple of months ago I was seeing a lot of things in the news, and I think we'll see more of them coming up here. I've noticed an uptick in certain space weather news topics. As I said, we'll touch on this from the previous slide, but these bad boys here, do these look familiar? Have you seen these pictures, or have you heard of them? That's right, we're talking about solar flares. Now, not that anybody's counting, but solar flares and CMEs, or coronal mass ejections, are technically two different things. They can happen independently of each other, though they usually happen together. What we're usually talking about when people reference solar flares is we're actually talking about CMEs. We're talking about coronal mass ejections. Solar flares, for lack of a better word, is kind of just light. So things like camera lenses in space, unprotected, unfiltered camera lenses, like on telescopes in space, those are what's going to be mainly affected by that. Meanwhile, CMEs is actually a cloud of charged particles, physical material actually flying towards Earth, and those are actually what does a lot of the damage. So the big one that everyone's basically heard about, if you haven't, I suggest you look it up, it's pretty interesting, is the Carrington event, which happened in 1859. So, to put things in perspective, we are extremely technologically dependent today. If we had a Carrington event today, there would be unimaginable severe consequences, possibly trillions of dollars of damage globally, and possibly years to decades to recover from the damage it would do, because a lot of our systems, communication and power, are not hardened enough against situations like these. Now, everybody does reference the Carrington event because it was the most disastrous and largest and strongest recorded one. But these solar flares and CMEs happen more frequently than you would think, and they are pretty big at times, not as big as the Carrington, but they've happened over the years and the decades, and there's many examples. In 1929, the New York Railroad Storm, which is what is colloquially called, railroad system power surges and failures. So if you can think in 1929, 1930, around the time of the Great Depression, everything was basically shipped by railroad. Lots of things still are, but railroads were key and vital to the survival of a country. And if you can think that the entire New York railroad system was basically shut down, you can imagine the damage that would have done at the time. In 1972, there was a solar flare, and AT&T long-distance telephone systems had a complete system failure. Another one, March of 1989, there was a geomagnetic storm that hit Quebec Hydro. Quebec is a province here in Canada. Did some decent damage in Quebec. I think they were out for like 24 hours or something like that, but and had some after effects as well, which included completely halting the Toronto Stock Exchange later in August of that year. In 2006, there was a solar flare, which we lost contact from several of our satellites. I don't know what happened damage-wise, if we lost any satellites, but it's just another example. These things do happen more often than you think. We just don't hear about them because maybe they're just not quite big enough to be of public interest until they are big enough, and then they're everybody's interest. All of this is to say that today we are severely technologically dependent in all aspects of our life, but we don't have to be with regards to communication. There is an easy solution. We can be self-dependent and do it ourselves. Power grids and worldwide communication systems are vulnerable to natural and man-made threats. We didn't even talk about hackers that have attacked and ransomed power distribution companies or national cellular and internet outages, which have happened in the past 5 years nationally, countrywide, both in Canada and America. So with regards to communication specifically, we don't have to be dependent on these big corporate and government systems that are not hardened against certain man-made and natural disasters. We can do it ourselves, and amateur radio is the solution. Now, I won't leave you off on a bad taste in your mouth like that. So let's kind of try to lighten it up at the end with a bit of statistics. So here's some numbers worldwide. Top 10 countries in the world that have amateur radio operators. We've got the United States, then Japan, China, Thailand, United Kingdom, Canada, that's me, Germany, Spain, South Korea, and Russia. Those are the top 10 countries. And looking at the numbers, they're not huge, but they're probably more than you might have thought with regards to amateur radio, how many operators there were. And you might even be surprised by some of the countries like Japan, China, and Thailand, or even things like South Korea and Spain and Germany. It's not just limited to Western civilization by any means. Obviously, as you can tell, Japan is the second largest country, numbers-wise, with how many operators they have. This puts the total estimates, not just the top 10, but total estimates worldwide, are about 3 million, give or take. We don't have super accurate data, but that's the best guess that we've got at this time. The United States has the most operators out of any country, with nearly 760,000 operators, while Slovenia, which isn't even on this top 10 countries for raw numbers, has the highest operator density at 0.317% of the population. Now, there's a lot of us, and all of these people worldwide love many different aspects of the hobby. As I said before, ham radio really is, on the hobby side, a hobby of hobbies. There's so many different facets of the hobby that you could be interested in, and somebody next to you could be completely uninterested and interested in a completely separate part of the hobby that might be distantly related. But that being said, because there's so many of us worldwide, there's going to be plenty of like-minded people as well. They're going to be interested in the same weird, complex and quirky aspects just like you are, so you will not be alone. There will be something for you in the hobby that you will enjoy, and there will be others that will enjoy it with you. once you enter the hobby, once you dip your toe in the pool, you will inevitably find your own passion within it and have your own adventure and go down the rabbit hole just like Alice in Wonderland. You'll be sucked in and swept away, and you'll wonder where your time and money went. And that's it. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions, please ask. There are some additional slides. We won't go over them. They just kind of, if I was doing this in person, there's additional resources and references to help get people in person that I would do a presentation to get licensed, and I would help them out with that. But I have a different video if you want to check out the video, how to get your amateur radio license. Check it out on my channel. You'll be able to find it. And that's it, guys. Thanks for staying to the end of my presentation. I know it was a bit long, my apologies, but I did try to summarize in one whole singular video everything that I can give to a beginner trying to get into the hobby about amateur radio. I tried to go everything from A to Z, as surface level as I could, to give you guys some content and material that would pique your interest and further your ambition into the amateur radio hobby. So please like the video if you liked it, dislike it if you disliked it, but most importantly, please leave a comment and let me know your thoughts on the presentation and the content I tried to deliver in its entirety. Let me know about the information and the actual content within the presentation itself, especially. I want to know, did it help you at all? The purpose of this video and this presentation was to help and inform people, and especially, hopefully, get you interested in a certain aspect of the hobby, whatever that aspect you find interesting is. Let me know, did I achieve that goal? What could I have changed? What could I have done better, added, removed, etc.? Constructive criticism is a plus, and it will help me further better my presentations and videos in the future. But again, thank you very much, guys. My name's Eric, VA3FYB, the ham radio hoser. And until the next time, we'll see you. 73.